Today's talk about invasive species will be presented by Dr. Beatriz Nobua-Berhmann. She is the Urban Forestry and Natural Resources Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension, serving Orange and Los Angeles counties. She obtained her PhD from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, studying the ecology of insect-plant interactions. Beatriz's current research and extension program at UCCE is focused on finding appropriate management strategies for invasive species, pests that threaten the integrity of Southern California's urban forests and natural areas.
All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. All right. And
yes, that's right.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon, I guess already to everyone, and thank you for being here. So today I will be presenting part 2 of the Invasive Species in California webinar, and I will be focusing on emerging tree pests for this webinar as a good urban forestry advisor would. So I want to start this talk just to go through some basics. And we're talking about invasive species, so species that are here and they're not native to our area, but there's really a difference between what we call invasive versus what we call exotic. So an exotic species is a species that has been introduced into a new environment, usually introduced by human, could be voluntary or involuntarily. And many of the species that we normally use every day are exotic species. So most of the crops we use are exotic species. For example, eggplant is native to India. But there's a difference when an exotic species could become an invasive species. And that is when the introduction of this particular species causes some kind of economic, environmental harm or harm to human health. So not everything that is not native from our area is necessarily an invasive species. Now, how do these exotic and invasive species get here? Well, there could be purposeful introduction either through legal or illegal means, or sometimes the introduction is unintentional, right? So this can happen through cargo, through commerce. Some people might bring an invasive or either an invasive or an exotic species like seeds from an exotic plant. A lot of it has to do with some other economical activities like horticulture, aquaculture, pet trade. Botanical gardens might be bringing a species that is for their gardens, but they end up being invasive in this new location. In just different kind of exchange of goods, usually make this movement of invasive species a lot easier, right? Not necessarily people are bringing it directly. It could be attached to the containers. A lot of the times egg masses get attached to the containers and are brought without us even knowing. The pellets in wood products or wood packagings that contain our goods might have invasive beetles inside of them, inside of the wood. So there's many different ways this invasive species get here, but we notice that in general, the trend of having more exotic pests entering our country and our state is correlated with the trend of having more imported goods coming in. So if you think about it, this map, for example, is showing all the trajectories of the cargo ships, and there's so much exchange between all parts of the world that is almost unavoidable that some species are gonna make it from one place to another. Just in California, we get about 9 new species of macroinvertebrate established per year. So that's usually what we call insects and nematodes and just big things that are invertebrates. And about 3 of them might become pests. And so what makes that difference? Why not? So not all of the species that get introduced in an area will become invasive, right? So in general, invasive species tend to follow this 10% rule. So 10% of non-native species will survive in the new environment, and then 10% of those that survive will become invasives. Only 10. So we have how many get established, how many get to spread, and how many get to be invasive. So it's always 10% less. So that's why we get lots and lots of interceptions and lots of new species that constantly coming to this area through this cargo ship, but only a very few of them will end up becoming invasive species. And those that become invasive cause lots of problem, and that just goes from spreading a disease to wiping out native species, or maybe altering ecosystem cycles in a significant way. So why is it that some species become invasive but others not? And these are some of the things that are characteristics of the invasive species that could somehow help explain this question. So normally invasive species are leaving behind the natural enemies that will regulate their populations in the native in the areas where they're native, right? But without those predators and parasites and pathogens that were regulating their populations, now they can grow and spread pretty quickly and widely. Rapid reproduction is something that usually is associated with invasive species, and fast growth as well. So a lot of invasive species like aphids can grow their populations really fast, and many times they don't even need to have males and females to be able to make more. So a lot of this, like aphids are parthenogenic, so one female can make a lot of daughters without needing a male to reproduce. So that makes it a lot easier to gain a lot of terrain really fast, like spread and grow really fast. The wide dispersal of this pest also makes it more easy to become invasive. And a lot of the times this dispersal is still human assisted. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then those species that are in a way more hard, like they can tolerate many environmental conditions, they can tolerate disturbances from human activities, those tend to have more chances of becoming invasive. And then ability to feed on many foods. So generalist species tend to be more likely to become invasive because then wherever they land, they'll find something to eat and survive and grow. And as I was mentioning, invasive species can be a big problem. They can be a threat to agricultural crops in having consequences in our economy. They can threat our landscape and our garden plants and have consequences on our green landscapes. They can threaten natural areas and really change how landscapes and communities look like. And they can threaten the environment because we tend to act and try to eliminate them, but then we need to use more pesticides to let's say if it's an agricultural pest, we'll use pesticides to get rid of that so we can keep having our crops, but then we are including more pesticides into the environment. So they really are a problem for many different reasons. And there's also the economical reasons are very important. So in the US, about 160 billions a year are lost because of invasive species. And in California, about 3 billion a year are lost to invasive species. And this is information just for crops and not considering other kinds of invasives. So when we think about tree pests, usually the main problem is how they affect the urban forest. So in our urban forest, if we have invasive tree pests, the consequences of those pests end up being the loss of green infrastructure. We have less green coverage. That gets associated with loss of ecosystem services. So trees provide us with water retention and flood control, and we won't have that. Clean air and energy savings, right? When we have trees in our urban environment, they cool off the environment around our houses, and we don't have to use our AC so much, and that really helps a lot with energy savings. And not to mention the impact on human health and well-being, both from the cooling effect of having trees and for the psychological effect of having greenery, like trees around us, which has been proved to increase your stamina and also reduce the chances of depression and other mental health problems. So really, what I am going to focus today is in this pests that attack our trees, and especially the ones that have some impact in an urban forest. To go into what kind of pests I'm talking about, the first one I want to show you is the South American palm weevil. So this is a huge weevil, is about 1.5 inches long, is native to South and Central America, and as the name says, it attacks palms. The main species of palm that is attacked by this beetle is the Canary Island palm, but they can also attack coconut palms, sago palms, and other palms. And right now they're present in San Diego County, and they are somewhat expanding their range. We are thinking that they're probably going to arrive to Orange County and then LA County in the next few years. Right now, we haven't seen them expand too rapidly, even though these beetles can fly a lot. They can disperse about 1 mile per day if they want to. The thing is, they really don't want to right now because there's enough palms in San Diego for them to colonize and attack and survive. The moment the populations of palms start declining more and more in San Diego County, these beetles are going to move north towards the rest of California. So the way these beetles attack a palm is usually the females end up being attracted to fresh wounds in like maybe pruning wounds. They get to a palm they like, they lay their eggs in the base of the young frond, so that will be the top of the palm. And the larvae will feed on that apical meristem, which is the growing part on the top of a palm, and grow, eating that part, basically the heart of the palm. So we'll have more beetles during the dry season, and as I said, usually you'll find them flying. They can fly up to 1 mile a day if they want to, and you'll find them either in the morning or later in the afternoon. And the way we can see how the attacks of these beetles on the palms can end up killing the palm, this is the kind of progression you see when you have South American palm weevil attacking a palm. So it starts at the beginning just affecting the apical meristem. So and the apical meristem is where the palm grows. It's where the new fronds or the new leaves come. So as the apical meristem starts dying, the palm starts looking kind of flat because there's no new leaves coming out. And after getting flat for a while, the palm can't keep growing and dies. So the kind of symptoms we'll see in an infested palm is, as I said, the flattened palm because we don't have new fronds. You'll see dead fronds on the top or flat or no new fronds, and then the rest of them are going to be green, right? So the old fronds are still going to be green and the new fronds are going to be either yellowing or absent. So those yellowing fronds on the top is another symptom of infestation. You can see signs of feeding from the adults on the fronds. And then when the fronds fall, you'll see holes on the base of the fronds, and that's where the little larvae has been chewing around in the pupa cases. So the larvae, once they're ready, they start spinning and they create this cigar-like pupal cases where they pupate until they become adults. And so when they become adults and leave, those pupa cases many times fall at the base of the pond. So these are kind of symptoms to be on the lookout for this pest. So and usually is a combination of several of those, but the flattened top of the palm is a pretty good giveaway. In the pupa cases, you'll find it once the reproductive season is over. So what do we do to manage this pest? Well, the first thing is to monitor your palms and make sure you catch any infestation early. If the palm is infested, that recommendation is to remove that palm before it can make more beetles in that palm and infest the surrounding ones. Removal is difficult and is very costly. You can imagine there's a lot of work involved in removing a big palm and make sure to do it safely. And also, once you remove the palm, you end up with the what's called like the head of the palm is full of larvae and pupae and adults as well. So you need to somehow manage that infested material that comes from the top of the palm. So it has to be either chipped, burned, or buried to prevent those beetles to go and infest new palms, right? In some cases, if the infestation has just started, we can use pesticides to treat that palm. They're hard to apply because the pesticides have to make it to the top of the palm, and for many very high palms, that's pretty difficult, and they are expensive. Right now, as of today, once you decide that you are going to treat a palm for South American palm weevil, you're going to have to treat it for us forever, basically. There's evidence of palms that were infested, they got treated. If they're still part of this apical meristem, the growing part of the palm that is still alive, the palm can recover, and we've seen that. So a palm that has been treated, if it was found early enough in the infestation, can recover and be lush again. But also we found that the moment we stopped treating that palm, because there was so many beetles in the surroundings, that palm got infested again and killed by the beetles. So it's a complicated decision what to do right now. There's prevention we can do. So keeping your palms healthy always helps, and reduce the pruning and unnecessary pruning, because remember that the pruning wounds will attract the female beetles to that particular palm. Right now, researchers in UC Riverside are trying to develop new strategies for managing this pest, and they're testing some trap and kill sort of method where they can Right now, the trapping has been done only for monitoring goals, but they're developing another kind of trapping in which they can attract the beetles to, and maybe like a telephone post or something that is not a palm, and kill them over there. So stay tuned, because there could be new and better management practices coming up soon. So if you want to learn more about the South American palm weevil, please come and check our websites in the Center of Invasive Research, Species Research. And also you can report palms that are infested, or you suspect they're infested with South American palm weevil, through this webpage. And I know that later on, Belinda and Peter will send you an email with all these links, so you have them for yourself. So moving on to another pest, the next one I want to talk about is the gold-spotted oak borer. This is also a beetle, but it's a completely different family of beetles. They are way smaller than the South American palm weevil. They're about 3/8 of an inch, and they are quite beautiful. They are related to this, they're in the same genus as the emerald ash borer, which are what we call the jewel beetles. So they usually have some kind of shininess to them. And they have these beautiful 6 gold colored spots on the top of their wings. But however beautiful they are, they're pretty nasty to our beloved oaks. So the gold-spotted oak borer is a pest of oaks. The larvae of these beetles feed on the phloem, and you can see here in this picture the damage that the larvae cause to the phloem. And so basically what the beetles do is they lay their eggs in the outer bark, and then the larvae, which is at the beginning is teeny tiny, is this little string here on the left side of the second picture. And the larvae digs inside, goes into the phloem and starts feeding. Mostly starts feeding in the inner parts of the bark, and creates all this damage, basically eats the phloem, so prevents the movement of nutrients throughout the plant. And as it develops, it starts moving more towards the outside of the bark, and once it's ready, after pupating, it comes out as an adult. The adults feed on the foliage, but that's not really a big problem. The problem is the larvae feeding that most of the times you can't see until the beetles emerge. They attack especially these 3 species of oaks. The coast live oak, very, very, very common, at least here in Southern California. The California black oak, also pretty common. And less susceptible species is the canyon live oak. So it could attack the canyon live oak, but it doesn't seem to have such a strong damage to this species. And what we will see if our oak is infested with gold-spotted oak borer, the main symptom or the main sign of infestation is this D-shaped exit holes. So this is when the beetle finishes pupating and is ready to leave the tree, they chew a little hole that is actually perfectly the size of the beetle just coming out. So their head is flat and the bellies are round, and that makes this D-shaped exit hole when they come out. So we'll see that in infested trees. Problem is that when we see the D-shaped exit hole, that means that the beetle already left our tree. But we can assume that there's more beetles developing inside that tree. Other symptoms that we might see are staining, and that happens in more advanced stages of the infestation. Dieback, so we'll see some of the branches of the tree start dying and the leaves get all brown and they die. Also symptoms of a more advanced infestation. So you can have an infested trees and not notice for a few years until you start seeing more dieback. If you kind of dig into the tree, you'll see this feeding damage done by the larvae. In many cases, we also see woodpecker activity on those trees because the pupae are so close to the outer side of the bark that the woodpeckers really like to go and feed on them. And although we'd love to have woodpeckers have biocontrol, really they try, but they don't really put a dent on the big populations of GSOB. So it's not really enough for controlling this pest. And this is another pest that started in San Diego. Actually, interestingly enough, GSOB or gold-spotted oakbird is native to southern Arizona. So it is native to the US, but it's not native to California. So the oaks in California have not co-evolved with this beetle and they cannot defend themselves. Also, the natural enemies that were in Arizona are not here in California. So originally we saw the infestation in San Diego, and we believe it arrived to this area through the movement of firewood, infested firewood. And from there, we keep seeing more locations and more focuses of infestation. And in all of those cases, the new focuses of infestation are linked to the movement of firewood from an infested area to a non-infested area. And the way we manage this pest is if we have a heavily infested tree, that tree should be removed as soon as possible. So a heavily infested tree is probably home of many, many more beetles inside. So if we leave that tree on site, there's going to be more beetles emerging and infesting the surrounding trees. But that's not enough. So if we fell the tree, we still have to do something to properly manage the infested wood, right? Because even once we fell the tree, the GSOB larvae and the pupae will still be on the bark. And there could be a lot of GSOB kind of hiding in that bark. And to give you an idea, just this little handful of bark produce this many beetles. So after a few weeks, we put that bark in a tub with this trap on top. We got 186 gold-spotted oakbird adults coming from just this little amount of bark. So what do we do with this infested wood? Well, there's many options. So we can chip the infested wood. If the chips are smaller than 3 inches, then those chips are GSOB free. If you want to use the wood for as firewood or for any other use, you're gonna have to season that wood for 2 years. And the way to do it safely is to tarp the wood. So just cover the wood either with a tarp or with a mesh. The tarp is probably less effective because it's really hard to make sure that the tarp stays on without being ripped or broken for 2 years. Like, you know, a pine cone falls on it or a dog jumps on the pile and will rip the tarp. Any little hole, the GSOBs will find and exit. So in the case of seasoning the wood, what you're hoping for is to have the wood in a very contained space, and all the adults will emerge and eventually die because they can't find any food. And then you have pest-free food, pest-free wood. You have to do it for 2 years. So if you have the space, you can do that. And another option is to remove the bark and use the rest of the wood as firewood. But the bark has to be chipped, right? So you can just remove the bark and use the rest of it as whatever use you want to give it. There are options for preventative treatments, but they're not really very practical or economical. So these are options only for high value trees, and only if there's GSOB in the vicinity of the tree. You would not apply a pesticide to a tree if there's no evidence of gold spotted oak borer infestation in the surrounding, in the 5 miles around the tree. Your oak has to be one of the 3 species, and a big oak, because usually what we found is that only oaks that are bigger than 8 inches in diameter get attacked, or they get attacked often. Everything that's more than that doesn't usually get attacked. And your tree has to be very healthy, in good vigor, because if your tree is already heavily infested with GSOB, the insecticides are not going to save your tree. So you will be your best option in that case is the removal of the tree. And always remember, if you're going to try to save a tree or apply a preventative treatment, you need to contract someone that has proper license to do it. In general, all the treatments for this kind of pest need a license just to be able to buy the correct pesticide. And pesticides have to be applied in a correct way so they don't have unwanted consequences. So really, someone who's a certified pesticide applicator will be the one who knows how to do that safely and in the correct way. So if you want to know more about gold spotted oak borer, we have a website, gsob.org, where we keep all the information. There's also outreach and education materials. There's more technical materials over there, depending on what you're looking for. And if you happen to find an infested tree in a new location, you can report an infested tree or a suspect infested tree, and we can go and check it out. And the third pest that I wanted to talk to you about is the invasive shadow borers and Fusarium dieback. So these are 2 species of beetle, the Polyphagous shadow borer and the Kuroshio shadow borer. They are teeny tiny, about the size of a sesame seed, and that's the female. The male is even smaller. They're present here in southern and central California, from Santa Barbara to San Diego. There's high chances that they will spread to Northern California. These 2 species of beetle are associated with a fungus. So this is a combination. This is like the super pest, right? So we have an insect pest that is the vector of a pathogen or a fungal pathogen. So each of these 2 species of beetle are associated with a different species of Fusarium, which is a tree disease, basically. So this fungus will cause what we call the Fusarium dieback, which is, as I said, a tree disease. So there's 65 species of hosts that are here in California. Among those 65 species of hosts, there's some smaller a smaller group of species that are heavily attacked by invasive shellhopers and Fusarium dieback. And you can see in here, the one that is the most sensitive of them all is the box elder. But other very, very common landscape trees like sycamores and London plays and cottonwoods, the valley oak and the English oak, those are also heavily attacked. In some trees that are very common in our natural and riparian forests, like our willows, and tend to get heavily attacked by these beetles. In this list, interestingly enough, there's another invasive species, which is castor bean. So castor bean is mostly considered a weed and gets heavily attacked by invasive shellhoppers. You would think that that might be good if the shellhoppers are somehow making a dent in the population of castor bean, but it's actually the opposite. Just having areas that are highly disturbed and they get a lot of castor bean growing there, that fosters more probability that the shellhoppers will be able to establish in that area. So there's several cases of this invasive species sort of helping other invasive species, which is great for them and really bad for us. And the way this beetle attacks the trees is that we'll have a mated female that will find a host. She will dig inside that host a gallery. In those galleries, she'll lay the eggs and grow the fungus that will feed exclusively on the fungus. So you always find the fungus, and the beetles are very closely, they have a very close relationship with each other. They depend on each other. And then once they grow, their siblings will mate inside their galleries, and the new female will be ready to start their own, her new gallery and her new family. And meanwhile, this is the gallery inside the tree. The fungus that grows in the walls of the galleries starts expanding and colonizes the rest of the wood, clogs all the vessels of the tree, and causes the severe dieback and eventually a tree death. So we can recognize trees that are infested with invasive shellhopper through these holes, perfectly round entry holes about the size of a medium ballpoint pen. And other symptoms that the trees might have that are not exclusively from these pests, but can guide us to notice that there's shellhopper in there, like staining, presence of frass, white powdery exudate in the case of avocados, and gumming in the case of golden rain and some other species of tree. So usually the population gets concentrated in a few trees before they spread to the rest of the area. And so it's because it stays in a few trees and the dieback is not really evident until advanced stages of the infestation, it's easy to miss it if you're not looking for it. That's why in management practices, the main thing is monitoring and find those infestations early. Once you find infestation, if you have heavy infested branches or trees, pruning or removal of those is our recommendation. Then sanitizing those tools so you don't move the pathogen from tree to tree when you're pruning another tree. And then the disposal of that infested wood is very, very important. I'll talk about that in a second. And lastly, you could treat those trees that are high value trees that are already infested with some combination of insecticides and fungicides, but there's not really a preventative treatment, so there's no a point on treating uninfested trees. We should only target treating trees once they become infested if they are high value trees and they are in good condition. And the way we correctly dispose of infected plant material for shareholder is to chip as small as possible, then solarizing or composting those chips. That will get rid of all the beetles. Chipping alone will get rid of 99% of the beetles, which is pretty good. And if you can't chip it and you have logs, you can also solarize or kiln dry those logs. But remember, these beetles can live in downwood for months. So you do need to manage that infested plant material. If you leave it on site, you'll still have the beetle problem on site. And again, we have a really nice website for this pest, and you can report any new areas of infestation through this website. The last pest I wanted to mention is the Mediterranean oak borer, which is found in Napa County. In 2019, it attacks blue oak and valley oak, and it leaves this kind of trellis-like galleries in the branches, and pretty similar to other pests that causes dieback. In the branches, when they die, they break and fall. And guess what? It can also disperse through firewood. So for this pest, which is a fairly new pest that we found, you can visit MOBPC or Mediterranean Oak Borer Pest Complex for more information, and you can report new infestations to either the Agricultural Commissioner's Office, our UCCE offices, or the CDFA's pest hotline. So to wrap it up, what do these all pests that I mentioned have in common? Well, they spread is associated with human activities, either firewood movement, green waste, or contaminated work tools. So firewood movement is something that, as you hopefully notice, is a big theme on tree pests. So we really, really encourage people to not move firewood and buy it where you burn it. So if you go camping this summer, make sure you don't bring firewood from home or from another forest. Just buy it in that location. You can make sure it is certified heat-treated firewood that is pest-free. When you buy local firewood, ideally within 10 miles or when you plan to use it. And once you're done and you go back home, please leave any firewood that you didn't use on site and don't bring it back home, because that's also moving firewood and you could be bringing a pest to your home area. Green waste movement, as I said, is another big pathway. So make sure you always discard infested plant material adequately. Chipping, composting, or solarizing are your best friends in this case. And when you get mulch, make sure it's mulch that is pest-free. Be very wary of free mulch, because if it comes from infested wood, it might contain pests. Contaminated tools, the way you prevent that is by disinfecting your saws and other tools when you go and after you prune a tree. And this is a really, really good practice for any kind of pruning, when you do any kind of pruning, just in case. So either alcohol, bleach, or Lysol will work. And the other ways you can help protect your trees from invasive pests is becoming familiar with these pests of concern, reporting those pests, educating your community, spread the word, manage your green waste responsibly. Again, don't move firewood. And then if you have any questions, you can always consult your County Agricultural Commission or UC Cooperative Extension and ask for help, ask for more information, and we're always happy to provide that. If you want to know more about other exotic and invasive pests, you can visit our UCIPM website, and there's, among other kinds of pests, there's one link for exotic and invasive pests. And another good way of staying up to date with different pests is to subscribe to the Home and Garden Pest newsletter, and you get different updates on new pests or pests of importance that are coming. And with that, I'd like to thank you and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Bea, for that excellent information. And thanks for the shout out on the newsletter.